Thank you for taking the opportunity to participate in training about child abuse prevention and recognition. I'm Stacy Kostavicki. I'm with Gulf Coast Kids House. We are Escambia County's only child advocacy center and child abuse prevention center. We spend our time helping children who've been egregiously abused to have effective intervention and also working with the community so that we can prevent child abuse. During this training, you're going to learn how to recognize if child abuse is occurring, how to report so that you can help those children, and also how to reduce opportunities so that child abuse doesn't occur. Thank you for caring enough about our community and our kids to participate in this.
My name is Kirsten Busey. I'm the program manager for the Child Protection Team. We are a regional program that is co-located at all the child advocacy centers from Escambia over to Walton County. Our role is to assist DCF and law enforcement when they're investigating allegations of abuse or neglect by providing specialized services that really focus on evidence collection. The primary services would be forensic interviews of child victims, as well as medical examinations. There's 4 main categories of abuse. There's neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse or mental injury. Neglect is by far the most common maltreatment that gets reported to the abuse hotline. Neglect actually has several subtypes as well. There's actual physical neglect where a child just isn't having their basic needs met. They're not being fed, they're not being clothed, they don't have adequate housing. Then there's another category, medical neglect, and obviously the most vulnerable population would be children who have special medical needs that require ongoing treatment and care. And if a parent is not meeting those needs, that child could be in grave danger depending on their diagnosis and their medical issues. The third type is actually the most common and probably doesn't get as much publicity as it should, but it's inadequate supervision. And obviously our birth to 5 population is at the highest risk because they don't have the ability to keep themselves safe. They're relying on a caregiver to do that. So a lot of the child death cases that we get involved in actually involve underlying issues of not being adequately supervised. The most common situation where we see significant neglect usually also is accompanied by a parent who has untreated mental illness or has a substance abuse issue where their attention is focused on something other than the needs of their child. We often see very young infants. We call it failure to thrive, but essentially they're just not being fed adequate nutrition to make them grow according to how they should. And a lot of times we have mothers who are struggling with either substance abuse or postpartum depression, and they're not feeding their infant. It actually can be very detrimental if a child doesn't receive adequate nutrition for their brain to develop within the first 6 months of their life. No matter what interventions are put in place after that, statistics show us that they will never actually reach their full potential. They will always have some sort of delay because of that, their brain not developing because of the nutrition. So certainly we take failure to thrive cases very seriously. And the other forms of neglect I spoke about also oftentimes have those other situations in the household where parents are using drugs, not bringing their children to the doctor, not using their financial resources wisely because they're putting them into other, to supporting their substance abuse habits. Physical injury, of course, we still have our most vulnerable population as the birth to 5. We see the highest rate of child deaths as a result of physical injury in our birth to 1 population because children really don't have the ability to protect themselves. There's a couple of things that come to mind, just easy things to remember as a community member. Those who don't cruise don't bruise. So anytime you see any type of bruise on an infant who is not mobile, can't move from here to there on their own, they really shouldn't have any bruises on their body. They have a lot of collagen, they have a lot of protection between their skin and their bone, and so it's really hard to bruise an infant. So any bruises on a baby are concerning. And then you get into the older age where they do toddlesome, they fall forward. That's how we move through the world, is forward. So anytime you see injuries on the back of a young child, that would be concerning. The other acronym that comes to mind is something we call 10-4, which is torso, ears, and neck. Those are areas of the body that on the birth to 4 population are extremely suspicious for being inflicted. It's hard to bruise our abdomen. We don't have any bones in our abdomen. Usually our neck is a protected area. If we were to fall, we don't get bruising to our neck. So that can be a sign of strangulation, which obviously is a very risky situation for a child. And then the same thing with our ears. They're a protected part of our body. And we most commonly see ear bruising from a slap or a pinch and a pull. So anytime you see an injury, at the child protection team, we spend a lot of time matching up the history and the child's developmental stage with the injury that we're seeing. So leave that to the professionals. That's what we're trained to do. But certainly if you ever see concerning injuries on a child or injuries of various stages of healing or different types of injuries like bruises and burns on the same child, that should certainly raise your level of concern and would be reportable. In the state of Florida, the use of corporal punishment as a form of discipline is not illegal. Where it crosses the line and starts to become concerning and considered to be physical abuse is if you leave an injury behind. So even an injury on the bottom is an indicator that you went too far. You crossed the line and you left a mark on the child, and that, according to Florida statute, is considered to be physical abuse. And physical abuse doesn't just stop at bruises. That's the most common that we see, but we also consider, fractures, burns, internal injuries, those kinds of things are things that we commonly see at the child protection team and are forms of physical abuse. It's very rare that we would see a child who had been an alleged victim of only one of those maltreatments that I discussed. It's interesting, a lot of our children that we initially see for physical injury we'll see later as a school ager for sexual abuse. So a culture of violence in the household, I'm not saying all the time, but can often be accompanied by sexual abuse. It's a power and control situation. And so the other thing that we didn't really talk about, but is very common denominator in all of these, is domestic violence, where maybe the child themselves is not the victim of the physical abuse, but there's a culture of violence in the household and the children are witnessing physical violence between their caregivers. That is a very common maltreatment that accompanies, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse as well. When you're talking about physical abuse and the risk factors for that, obviously the more difficult a child is to care for, the more at risk for being abused they are. The birth to 5 population is obviously the most vulnerable. The scary thing is that it really only takes 3 factors in any household to have an abuse situation: a parent, a child, and a set of circumstances. And that can be a child spilling a glass of milk, and just because of the stress already in that household, that can result in a physical abuse scenario. That said, there are certainly households that are more susceptible to that situation than others, and it is all based on the level of stress in that household. What are the parents' coping mechanisms like? Do they have social supports around them when things get tough with parenting that they can rely on and reach out to? Do they have concrete supports in place? Are they wondering how they're going to pay their light bill tomorrow? And so when that kid misbehaves, it's not really about the kid misbehaving. It's about, I am so stressed out because I don't have a car and I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills, and that's, they lash out, or an infant crying and they get frustrated with that crying. As far as neglect, I've kind of already touched on, households where you've got underlying mental health issues that maybe aren't being managed, substance abuse. Those are certainly scenarios that lend themselves to, a child not having their basic needs met.